Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel. A very exciting video today. We are going to be talking all about and doing 7 looks with the new Natasha Denona Bronze palette. I have never received so many tags on a palette on Instagram than when this thing came out. So many of you guys were curious to see if I was going to pick this palette up, if I was going to do 7 looks on it, if I thought that you should pick it up. So many questions surrounding this palette, and I myself was very interested in this one. You guys know how much I love my neutrals. You know how much I love Natasha Denona's palettes, especially her smaller palettes that are slightly more affordable. I'm definitely not going to call them affordable. And I was especially excited to see what I consider her first more neutral version of one of these size palettes. So that is what we're going to be doing today. I will be first sharing with you guys 7 looks with this palette, and then towards the end of the video I will get into my thoughts on the palette, the swatches, all the details, as well as a couple of comparisons. So hopefully you guys are excited about this one. We will jump into the 7 looks first, but before we do, special welcome to any of you that are new to my channel. I hope that you'll consider subscribing. Hit that notification bell if you want to be notified every time I upload a new video. And with that said, let's get in to look number 1. Alright, I hope that you guys enjoyed those 7 looks. I always love to hear from you guys what your favorite look was. Please let me know down in the comments below. Now let's jump into the details on this palette. So again, this is the Natasha Denona Bronze palette. It is a beautiful palette as far as the packaging, as far as the color story inside. I mean, it just looks like a warm bronzy lover's dream palette. The palette, as I mentioned before, is $65. I believe you can now buy it at Sephora. It is also available on Natasha Denona's website as well as Beautylish. The palette includes 6 mattes and 9 shimmers, and of the mattes and the shimmers there are some different formulas. That is one thing that I really love about Natasha Denona. She doesn't just have one shimmer formula and one matte formula. There are some differences in there, and there's things I like about the different formulas for different reasons. But I do want to insert here the swatches of the palette so you can see how they look swatched on the arm. This is a very beautiful color story. It worked really well for my skin tone. There are a few things about the color story that I personally think could be improved upon, and I'll get into that in just a minute, but I do want to first talk about the things that I really loved about this palette. It is definitely going to be a palette for a warm toned lover. If you don't like warm tones, if you are much more a cool tone fan, then you probably will not want to pick this one up because there are very few cool tones in here at all. Most of them lean quite warm. I do not mind that because I tend to favor warm tones a little bit more than I do cool tones in general. As far as the drawbacks or the things I would like to see done a little bit differently in this palette to make it just a little bit better, and I think that would have to be the color range. And mainly, I feel like there are a lot of medium to deep tones in here and not a lot of lighter tones. I know some of the bronzes and golds in here look quite light, but on my skin tone, I felt myself lacking something even lighter if I want to bring some brightness to my inner corner or to my lid or even to my brow bone. I didn't feel like I had options in here for that. Now that probably will only be an issue for those that are light or fair skin toned, and also those that prefer having something brightening on their lid or on their inner corner, which I definitely am one of those people. But as I was doing the 7 looks, there were quite a few of the looks that I just found myself wishing or wanting to reach for a shade that was lighter than what was included inside the palette. Now that may or may not be a drawback for everyone. To me, it is kind of a major drawback, especially when I'm investing in a higher end palette. I really want something that is going to give me good range from light to dark. I like something very, very light and also something very, very dark. I just feel like it gives an entire palette so much more versatility, and because I was lacking that lighter shade in here, and I'm talking something like either a matte ivory or a shimmery champagne, I felt like I didn't have the versatility that I wanted in some of the looks that I was creating. Now that said, I'm not opposed to reaching for something outside of a palette, but I do think that's a major consideration, especially if you are someone that travels with your palettes and you want an entire eye look or a variety of eye looks in one palette. That would definitely be an issue for me in traveling with this palette. And I think when I look at this palette and I think of, okay, I do think all these shades are beautiful, but there are quite a few shades in here that, while I wouldn't say they're the same, I think the formulas are quite different. The way they end up looking on the lid is quite similar, and for that reason I would have even more loved to have seen one of these similar shades taken out and something much more brightening and versatile put in its place. I would have even loved to see like a matte white eyeshadow in here. I know not a lot of people love matte white eyeshadows, but I actually really like them because they give other shades a lot more versatility. So for example, say that I had a matte white or even an ivory in here. I could take that matte white and put it either on my inner corner or all over my lid, and then put one of these glitter toppers on top of it and have that brightening effect that I am looking for. I remember when this palette was released and announced on Trendmood, I was reading the comment section. There were quite a few people that said there are quite a few shades in there that look similar. I'm curious to see it in person. And now that I have and have used this palette and used every shade inside here, I can see where that initial concern came from. So I want to swatch next to each other the shades that I think are the most similar, and I think they're going to be these 4 gold shades right here. So let's start with this shade right here, the shade Silk. And then next to that, I want to go in with this shade right here, which is True Bronze. And this is one of the shades that is more of a, it feels very lightweight and creamy. It feels like a glitter topper shade. It is quite a bit more glittery and reflective, and you can see that it is a little bit warmer as well. Next up, this shade Alloy, which is like a nice orangey bronze. There it is right there. So you can see those two are actually very similar. The formulas are different, but the color, and I think even the way they look on the lids, is very, very similar. And then the last one I want to compare is this shade in the corner, True Copper. This one does have a bit more of a kind of red-orange shift to it. So there are those shades next to each other. Now there are differences between all of them, but if you look at them as a whole, I think the differences are pretty minor. Now that might be a good or a bad thing depending on who you are. If you are just a major fan of a warm bronzy eye, you may love having 4 of almost the same shade with just subtle differences in the same palette. I can see how if that is the type of shade that you love, that you use every day, that you gravitate towards, if you only have one of those, you're probably going to run through that shade very quickly. So you might appreciate having 4 shades that have just a subtle difference to them. But for those that maybe like me like a little more versatility in a palette, I would definitely have loved to see really any one of these shades taken out in place of something a little bit more brightening. As for the matte shades in here, I'm really happy with the range of matte shades they gave inside here. I do think if you have very fair skin, this looks quite light, but it showed up on my eyes much more dark and pigmented and intense than I thought it was going to. I'm going to swatch it for you guys just right here. And I don't even know that on the arm that does it justice. This was a very, very pigmented shade. I think it's beautiful, but I imagine if you have very fair skin and you want something subtle, this may not be subtle enough for you, which is one more reason why I think an ivory or something light would have been really nice to include in this palette. But other than that, I really did love these 3 transition shades right here. I felt like they were all a little bit different, but they were all beautiful, worked beautifully as either transition shades or lid shades. And I really love the deep shades in here as well. I love this really, you guys know how much I love a warm, rich brown. This is a beautiful one. It is a quite red brown, but I really think it's beautiful on the lid. I loved this warm kind of medium tone brown as well, and I really love this color right here. I think this is one of her creamy matte formulas. It has almost like a purple look to it, but it looks so beautiful on top of the warm shades inside here. And if you put it just with that purple that was right next to it, so this shade right here, you can get a really nice cool toned smoky look. As far as the formulas of all of these shades go, I loved the formulas of all of these. I thought they all worked really well. Very, very pigmented, but also very easy to blend. So now I want to get into a couple of comparisons. Now when I first got this palette, or even when I saw it online, I thought, okay, this is a pretty palette, but bronzes are definitely shades that we have all seen before. I'm sure a lot of us would look at this palette and think, I probably have those shades inside my collection. I definitely thought that when I first got the palette, but as I was going through my collection trying to find dupes, I was surprised that I could not find as many dupes as I thought I would be able to find. But I did find some similarities, so we're going to go through a couple palettes that had the most similarities in them. And I want to start with the Double Entendre palette by ColourPop. Now, there are a couple of shades in here that I would say are nearly identical dupes, but when I look at these 2 palettes, I see more of just a similar vibe. They're both warm-toned, bronzy palettes. I might even say the ColourPop palette has a bit of a leg up in that it gives you a better range. It gives you lighter tones in here, whereas this one is more medium to deep tone. This one covers the whole range from light to deep. But you're definitely not going to get the variety of bronzes inside here. But let's go ahead and swatch the couple of similarities that I have seen. First off, the matte kind of reddy brown, and that is this shade right here, Magma. And I want to swatch that next to this shade right here. So starting with the shade Magma, this is from Natasha Denona. Wipe my finger off, and then let's go into this shade right here in the ColourPop palette. And I'm not going to say the name of it because if you guys have not read the names in this ColourPop palette, kind of disgusting. So there they are right there. You can see they're a little bit different. The one from Natasha Denona is a little bit richer, a little bit darker, but built up on the eyes, I think they're going to give a similar effect. Next, I want to compare this shade Palladium. Let's swatch that right here to this shade right here in the ColourPop palette. This is the shade Draft. So somewhat similar. This one is a little bit more cool tone. But there they are right there. Now let's compare this medium tone matte brown, the shade Suntan. Swatch that right here. I'm going to compare that to this shade. And I think in the pan they look a lot more similar than in person. Okay, yeah, those are completely different. Those aren't even close. Nice try, Mandy. Good try. Now let's go into this shade Ridge. Another matte shade. There it is, and compare that to this matte shade right here, which is the shade, okay, I don't want to say this name either. Let's just compare that shade right there. Okay, those 2 are very similar actually. And my last comparison I want to do is compare the shade Silk, which is right here, the shimmer. And let's compare that to this shimmery shade right up here. Okay, so there are those 2. They are a little bit different. This one is a little bit warmer. But on the whole, on the eyes, I think they're going to give you a similar look. Now I want to move into a comparison with the Urban Decay Born to Run palette. Now this is a very versatile palette that I often pull out when I'm doing comparison videos because I often find a lot of dupes inside this palette. And despite how much versatility is in here, there is quite a bit of bronze inside the Born to Run palette. So let's do a couple of comparisons in here. And I want to start off with this shade in the corner. This is the shade Gloaming. This is probably one of my favorite shades that I used from the Natasha palette. Kind of a red bronze that has a pink shift to it. Let's compare that to the shade Double Life inside the Born to Run palette. Okay, those look much less similar swatch than they do in the pan, so those are quite different. Now let's compare that red bronze, the shade High Degree, to this shade Accelerate inside the Born to Run palette. So those two are quite similar. Now let's compare the shade True Copper and compare that to the shade Ignite in the Born to Run palette. Okay, those two are also very, very similar. And last, let's compare this matte shade Ridge to the shade Riff inside the Born to Run palette. This is probably my most used shade in the Born to Run palette. It has a pretty nice dip in it. So those two are a little bit different, but somewhat similar. So those are probably the most similar shades that I can see in there, but that's quite a few. Last palette I want to do some comparisons in is the original Jaclyn Hill palette. Now, I have not used this palette a whole lot. In fact, it's one of the palettes that I keep promising you guys I'm going to do a 7 looks video on that is still on my list of things to do. I know you guys are probably like, yeah, Mandy, you've been saying that for 9 months. When is it going to happen? But I was very surprised to find that this palette had quite a few dupes in it. So I want to start off with this pink shade right here. This is the shade Bliss, which is kind of a pink with a gold flip to it. So there's the shade Bliss. And I want to swatch that next to this shade up here in the Jaclyn Hill palette. So there are some differences in those shades. This one's a little bit more pink and a little bit lighter. So these are definitely not exact dupes. You can see this one is a little bit lighter, but they both kind of have that gold flip to them. Moving over to this shade right here, High Degree, which is kind of the red toned bronze or shimmery red. So there's High Degree, and I want to compare that to this shade right here. So those two are quite similar. Now I want to compare the shade Silk down here to this shade right here. So as you can see, this one is a little bit more of like a cool bronze, whereas this one has a little bit of warmth to it, but somewhat similar. And I think on the eyes they're going to give you a similar look. Now let's take the shade Palladium, just kind of the cool bronze, and I want to swatch that next to this shade right here. So those two are quite similar as well. Now I want to take a look at a couple of matte shades. Let's take the shade Ridge, and I want to swatch that next to this shade right here. So this one is a little bit deeper, but once you kind of blend it out, they are somewhat similar. Now let's take the shade Beach, just kind of your lightest transition shade, and I want to swatch that next to this shade right here. I think you could probably do either of these two, but I do think Beach shows up a little darker than it looks in the pan, so let's try this one first. Okay, so those are quite similar as well. So there are those similarities. I think there's quite a few in here. Now, I don't think that the Jaclyn Hill palette gives you as many options for a bronze shimmery lid. I think really the only one you get is this one right here. But as far as the reds and the oranges and the transition shades in here, I do think there are a lot of dupes. So last I want to share with you guys my final thoughts on the Natasha Denona Bronze palette. I do think it's a lovely palette. As a big fan of Natasha Denona's eyeshadow formula and as a fan of bronzy eye looks, I think I will get a lot of use out of this palette. I definitely stand by my opinion on the fact that I just feel like this is missing a lighter tone. I feel like if it had something very light and bright, just honestly one shade, it would have even more versatility, and I think it would make some of the shades that seem similar, it would give them a lot more versatility depending on how you use them or what you pair on top of each other. But I do love the palette. I think it's beautiful. It was very easy to work with. I didn't have any issues with any of the formulas or any of the shades. So ultimately, I think it's going to come down to two major things. Number one, your budget. If you are someone that is on a budget, you definitely can find affordable bronzy toned eyeshadow palettes out there. Like some of the ones I mentioned, I would highly recommend the Double Entendre palette if you like a warm bronzy eye. But if you are a fan of warm tones and you like very warm, bronzy, even golden looking eye looks, then I think that this is definitely a good contender, especially if you are someone that has been wanting to try a Natasha Denona palette out, but maybe you thought her first two mid-sized palettes were maybe not in your color range. Maybe you thought the Love palette was too pink and purple. Maybe you thought the Sunrise palette was a little bit too bold. This one is definitely going to be more neutral. Now, I think if you are someone that likes to be very creative with your eye looks, I think it's essential to have a good range from light to dark to be able to get more versatility out of your eye looks. Otherwise, I feel like they can end up looking like one version of the same thing. And I actually feel that way with a lot of the looks that I created even for you guys in the 7 looks. I felt like the end result ended up looking like a similar version of the same thing, which is something to consider if you are someone that likes more versatility. Maybe this would not be the palette for you unless you were okay with reaching for a different shade to give you something more brightening, because I think that's really just where the hole is in this palette, as I've said 6 times already. But that's really the only criticism that I have with this palette. For me, I think it's kind of a big one because I just feel like this could have been an almost perfect palette if they just would have included that one shade. But I am just one person. This is just my opinion, and I recognize not everyone has the same style as me or the same skin tone or the same preferences in what they need from an eyeshadow palette. But at the end of the day, I am very happy with this one. I know I'll get a lot more use out of this one than I did the Love palette. I think it's beautiful. I'm really happy with a lot of the eye looks that I created, especially today's. I think today's eye look is probably one of my favorites. But I hope that this video was helpful for you guys. If you have been wondering if this palette is for you, I hope this gave you some insight. But that is all I have for you guys today. Thank you guys again for stopping by. I hope that you enjoyed this one. Be sure to subscribe if you have not yet subscribed to my channel. I hope that you are all doing well. I hope you have a good one, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye. So that is kind of what we're going to be doing today. Stop clapping, Mandy. Oh, it's always a problem for me. Battery's dying. Dang it. I always hate when my battery dies because then I have to take my camera off of the tripod and put it back on, and sometimes it's like slightly crooked, and that always bothers me in editing when my background like twitches, changes. Oh, and I've already messed it up. I'm doomed. I don't know where it was before. Shoot. Palette, it is definitely... Stop saying definitely.